They called it the capital of the North. A city of towering spires and holy processions. But step inside its walls in the year 1500, and you wouldn't find romance. You'd find mud swallowing carts whole. Blood running through the streets. And a single royal order that could turn neighbors into traitors overnight. This was York, where survival wasn't a struggle. It was half of life itself. Step through the gates of York at the turn of the 16th century and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the minster rising above the rooftops. It's the smell. Thick. Sour. Human. Animal. Rotting refuse baking in damp air that never quite clears. York was the second most important city in England, but it was trapped inside ancient Roman and Viking walls, corset-tight and bursting at the seams. Thousands of people were crammed into a space barely larger than a modern university campus. Every alley, or snickelway, as locals called them, twisted like a vein through the city's body. They weren't really streets. They were narrow trenches of mud, lined with open gutters where waste flowed openly down the center. There was no underground plumbing. No sanitation system. Just gravity and hope. Residents emptied chamber pots from upper windows. Butchers slaughtered animals in full view of passers-by. In the shambles, meat hung from wooden shelves, dripping steadily onto slanted floors designed so blood could run straight into the street. And waiting below were the city's unofficial cleaners, pigs. Herds of them roamed freely, snuffling through midden heaps piled outside front doors. The mud became so legendary that in 1532 Parliament had to pass an act just to pave the main streets because carts were being swallowed whole. Imagine that. A city so vital to the kingdom that it required legislation to stop it from eating its own traffic. And above these streets leaned the houses. Timber-framed, jettied structures stacked upward and outward. Second floors overhung the first. Third floors pressed even farther. It wasn't style. It was strategy. Taxes were based on ground space, so you built outward into the air. But this cleverness came at a cost. The streets below became dark tunnels where sunlight rarely touched the cobblestones. Privacy didn't exist. Thin walls meant you heard arguments, laughter, childbirth, prayers. You knew your neighbor's secrets whether you wanted to or not. Your survival depended on your guild, powerful brotherhoods of craftsmen and merchants who controlled trade, prices, and opportunity. If you weren't protected by a guild, you were exposed. Yet amid the filth and noise, there was structure. The rivers were highways of commerce, bringing wool, wine, and spices. The Great Bridge across the Ouse wasn't just a crossing. It was a floating neighborhood, lined with houses, shops, even a chapel perched above the water. Life here wasn't isolated. It was communal, loud, layered. And above everything, dominating skyline and soul, was the church. Over 40 parish churches rang their bells daily, marking hours, curfews, and devotion. The sound never truly stopped. York breathed faith. It depended on it. And that faith was about to be tested in ways the city could never have imagined. By the 1530s, York wasn't just devout. It was economically built on devotion. The skyline wasn't dominated by the minster alone, but by St. Mary's Abbey, the richest monastery in the north of England. The monks weren't cloistered mystics detached from daily life. They were landlords, employers, bankers, caretakers of the poor. Their lands fed the city. Their alms sustained the desperate. Their presence stitched together York's fragile social fabric. So when Henry VIII severed ties with Rome, it wasn't some distant theological argument echoing from London. It was an earthquake. The dissolution of the monasteries meant the crown would seize church lands and wealth. To the king, it was consolidation of power. To York, it was annihilation. Remove the abbeys, and you remove jobs. Remove charity, and you remove stability. Remove sacred ritual, and you rip the heart out of the city. In October 1536, that fear exploded. A lawyer named Robert Aske emerged as the unlikely leader of a rebellion that would shake the kingdom. This wasn't a ragged mob with farm tools. This was an organized force of nearly 30,000 men, lords, knights, craftsmen, laborers, marching under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. They demanded the restoration of monasteries, the removal of corrupt advisors, and the preservation of their faith. When they reached York, there was no siege. No desperate defense. The gates opened. For a brief, intoxicating moment, York stood defiant. The city became the capital of a free Catholic North. Processions filled the streets again. Monks returned. Bells rang not in fear, but in triumph. It must have felt like destiny bending back toward them. But Henry VIII was not a king who tolerated defiance. He offered pardons. Promised a parliament in York. Swore reconciliation. The rebel army dispersed, believing they had been heard. And once they had gone home, the king struck. Leaders were arrested. Promises evaporated. And Robert Aske, once welcomed as a hero, was dragged back to York in chains. On a hot July day in 1537, crowds gathered below Clifford's Tower. The same stone keep that had watched centuries of conflict now bore witness to something colder. Aske was not granted a swift execution. He was hanged in chains from the tower walls, a slow, agonizing death designed to be seen. Designed to be remembered. It was theater. A warning written in flesh. The message was unmistakable. The North had been broken. And Henry didn't stop with executions. He dismantled the physical power of York piece by piece. St. Mary's Abbey was seized. Its roof stripped of lead. Its stones quarried for government buildings. Libraries filled with centuries of manuscripts were scattered or destroyed. Monks were cast out into a world that had no place for them. With the monasteries gone, the safety net collapsed. The poor flooded the streets. Beggars multiplied. Guilds tried to fill the gap, but charity without wealth is only a gesture. Then came control. To ensure York would never rise again, Henry established the Council of the North. They moved into the former abbot's house, transforming it into the king's manor. York became an administrative capital, a northern outpost of royal authority. Lawyers and officials replaced monks and pilgrims. The processions stopped. The mystery plays, those grand, communal performances that told biblical stories through every guild in the city, were suppressed. Too Catholic. Too dangerous. The bells still rang. But they sounded different now. Where once they marked celebration and unity, they now told over suspicion and silence. Conversations lowered in volume. Loyalty became a question. Faith became something you guarded carefully. York had survived mud, stench, and overcrowding. But surviving the king was something else entirely. By the time Elizabeth I sat firmly on the throne, York wore a different face. Outwardly, it was obedient. Protestant. Orderly. The Council of the North had turned it into a miniature London, a place of hearings, decrees, and polished boots echoing through former monastic halls. The city that once roared with pilgrimage now whispered behind closed doors. But faith doesn't disappear just because it's outlawed. It hides. Behind timbered walls and beneath slanted roofs, the old religion survived in secret. One of those houses stood on the shambles, the butcher's street where blood once ran into the gutters. There lived Margaret Clitherow, a butcher's wife and mother of 3. To her neighbors, she was ordinary. To the crown, she was dangerous. She built a priest hole in her attic, a narrow chamber hidden between beams, and sheltered Catholic clergy hunted by the state. In 1586, she was discovered. Her crime was clear. Harboring priests was treason. What followed was not mercy. To avoid forcing her children to testify, she refused to enter a plea. The law had a punishment for silence. She was laid on the ground. A sharp stone was placed beneath her back. A heavy wooden door was set over her body. And weight, hundreds of pounds of it, was slowly added. 700 pounds. The pressure increased until her ribs shattered and her breath was crushed from her lungs. It happened within the walls of a city that once called itself holy. Her house still stands. Quiet. Narrow. A shrine to a faith that refused to die even under stone and iron. Meanwhile, the cultural heartbeat of York continued to fade. For centuries, the mystery plays had filled the streets with color and sound. Entire guilds staged scenes from creation to Judgment Day, transforming wagons into moving theaters. It was civic pride made visible. In 1569, they were suppressed for the final time. Silence replaced spectacle. Life adjusted. Alehouses thrived, partly because small beer was safer than the river water that carried waste downstream. Merchants dined in the grand hall of the merchant adventurers, feasting on imported wines and roasted game. For the poor, entertainment was harsher: bear-baiting, cockfighting, crowds gathering near the castle to gamble on blood and bone. And nature reminded everyone how fragile the city remained. In 1564, a brutal winter flood tore down the River Ouse. Ice and water smashed into the Great Bridge, ripping away 2 central arches. 12 houses collapsed into the current. 12 people drowned. The city was physically split in two. Rebuilding took years. Money had to be begged from across the country. York, once wealthy from wool and pilgrimage, was now struggling to repair its own foundations. As the century neared its end, the transformation was undeniable. The abbeys were ruins. The monasteries were memories. The wool trade was shifting west to rising towns like Leeds and Halifax. What had once been a manufacturing powerhouse became something quieter, an administrative capital. A city of clerks and courtrooms. Of lawyers walking past broken cloisters. At midnight on December 31, 1599, York stood changed beyond recognition. It had begun the 1500s with bells ringing over monks chanting in candlelight. It ended the century under watchful eyes, where faith moved in shadows and rebellion was unthinkable. The mud was still there. The narrow streets still leaned inward. But the spirit had hardened. York survived. Not by glory. Not by rebellion. But by endurance. Because in the 1500s, survival wasn't just part of life here. It was half of it.